Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Champions Weekend Cheltenham Town preview. It's the start of a weekend we're going to be taking a look back at some major titles that Cheltenham Town have achieved in their history, particularly in recent decades. The 1985 Southern League win, the 1999 promotion to the Football League for the first time, and of course the 2016 national title victory to get back into the Football League at the first time of asking. Joining me for this Champions Weekend preview, I'm delighted to say, is the Gloucester Echo's Cheltenham Town reporter, John Palmer. And I started by asking John about why that 1985 title victory as winners of the Southern League was so significant in the history of the football club.
I think the 84-85 was so significant because it was the first time Cheltenham had ever got into a national division. So they went up to what is now the National League. I think those days it was sponsored by Gola, but it was the Alliance Premier and then Gola League became the conference and now National League. And Cheltenham had never been at that level before in terms of the national team. So suddenly they'd be playing teams up north, travelling a lot further, in with some really big clubs. And they had some good seasons in the Southern League when the Southern League was the top level of non-league football. But to get into that national division, it really felt like a step forward for the club. Uncharted territory, really sort of gripped the town's imagination probably. I'd say it was, Cheltenham had been going for 98 years at that point. And really they'd had a few little FA Cup runs, 33-34, reaching the third round. And definitely some good Southern League seasons under the likes of Bob Etheridge. But I think that achievement under John Murphy in 84-85 at that point was the best the team had ever done.
As with any promotion, of course, it's a huge task to try and get your team up, but it was particularly a huge task towards the back end of the season for that Cheltenham team because there was incredible fixture congestion.
Yeah, it's incredible that the Southern League Cup, which is probably not taken that seriously by some teams now, was a bit more of a big deal in those days. And Cheltenham had 6 group games to play. And I think they played something like 11 games in that competition by the end, 12 games. So 2-legged semi-final and a 2-legged final. So they went all the way to the final where they lost to Fisher Athletic over 2 legs. And that was played in the last weeks of the season. So due to the Southern League Cup run, they had 4 FA Trophy games, 4 FA Cup games. Luckily, there were only 38 games in the league that season rather than 42. But they had a big fixture backlog. They had to play 8 games in the last 14 days, including those 2-legged Southern League Cup final against Fisher. So it was a tall order, and I think they really were on their last legs going into the last game of the season. They lost to Fareham on April the 20th, and then they still had to play the 2 Southern League Cup games: RS Southampton, Trowbridge, Gloucester, Fisher in the league, and Alvechurch, which were the last game on the 4th of May. So they were playing quite often. Looking back, they were playing back-to-back days: 20th and 21st of April. They played 30th of April, 1st of May. And I think they did amazingly well to get to that last day of the season in the position they did, knowing that a win would have given them the title against Alvechurch.
Yeah, we're very lucky, John, that for our Zoom chat, looking back at the 1985 title success, we're going to be joined by 3 absolutely huge names just from the club's history, let alone from that team. John Murphy, of course, the manager at that time, who's now director. Paul Collicutt, who was skipper, and also Mark Boyland. Can you tell me a bit about each of those individuals and how significant a role they played in that 1985 team?
Yeah, well, John Murphy took over from Alan Wood. Alan Wood had got Cheltenham promoted to the Premier Division of the Southern League 2 years earlier, so 82-83. He'd won the Southern League Midland Division title. And Forest Green were actually one of the challengers for the title that year, along with Sutton Coldfield. But Cheltenham went up, so they were back in the Premier at the first attempt. And Alan Wood got the sack after a 5-2 FA Trophy defeat by Yeovil just before Christmas. And John Murphy was a regular in the team. He had been captain at times. He was a fullback. Uncompromising player, and he got put in charge, and I think he was 29 at the time and worked full-time at GCHQ, had quite a high-powered job at GCHQ, but he managed to juggle the 2. His first game was a good start. They beat Gloucester City 4-1 on Boxing Day, that was Boxing Day 1983, and they improved during the second half of that season, and they made some key signings in the summer. And then 84-85, obviously things really went progressed to winning the league. So he was a young manager. He did play on a little bit when he took over, but he really started to focus on management, even though he's probably just coming up to 30. So he was the sort of mastermind behind it. Had a close relationship with the players. Paul Collicutt was there. Paul Collicutt had been brought in by Alan Wood, I believe. John Murphy made Collie captain after John Murphy started focusing on management. So Collie was the leader on the pitch. He had an interesting season, which we'll hear more about, but he dislocated his collarbone a couple of times, ended up in hospital, including on the last day of the season against Alvechurch. He had a really bad virus and tonsillitis going into the last couple of weeks of the season, missed a couple of games, but managed to come back for that last game against Alvechurch to take his place in the back four. So he was a really important figure in the back four next to Stuart Corns, who was the other centre-back. So Collie was a big player in that team. And then Mark Boyland was probably the sort of the jewel in the crown, 31 goals that season. Had a few different strike partners, but he was top quality player. Murphy brought him in the previous summer from Banbury, I think it was. He made a couple of other really important signings, including Brian Hughes, who also won Player of the Year and also chipped in with 26, 27 goals from midfield. But Boylan was the one that everyone who watched Cheltenham regularly in those days raved about for his goal-scoring exploits. So he played up front with Nick Gazzard, who I think had an injury that season, so he didn't play as much as he should have done. But Steve Cottrell was a young lad coming through. Mark Hacker was another player that played up front that season. Bernie Wright. But Boylan was, the consistent one up front, consistently banging the goals in. And he scored on the last day of the season against Alvechurch, the opener, before Brian Hughes got the winning penalty to make it 2-1.
Well, on Sunday evening, John, we're going to be focusing then on the 1999 title-winning squad. Of course, the first time the club gained promotion to the Football League. And in terms of the club's achievements, it's one that gets spoken about a huge amount. Of course, it was the 20th anniversary last year. And it's quite understandable that it has to be one of the most important moments in the whole history of Cheltenham Town Football Club, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think 84-85 took Cheltenham into a new territory, going up into a national division. But the dramatic transformation of the club in 98-99, going into the Football League for the first time, going from semi-pro to full-time. And in those days, I think there was only one, possibly two teams in the conference that were full-time. Rushden Diamonds were, and I think Doncaster maybe were. All the rest of the teams were semi-pro. So Cheltenham had never even really considered it before. There was a bit of pressure on that year because they'd won the trophy and come second in the league the year before. But to go and win it and get to the semi-final of the trophy, but to win the league, only the second season back in the conference under Steve Cottrell, that was historic. And that's probably the season that changed the club forever.
What was that era like in terms of the progression the club made under Steve Cottrell?
It was non-stop success, really. He came in January 97, took over from Chris Robinson, got a promotion in sixth, halfway through that season. He got a promotion at the end of that season to the conference. So Southern League Premier Division runners-up. Chris Robinson had brought in some good players, but the board felt it was time for a change. Steve Cottrell came in, so obviously he played for the club in that 84-85 season. He'd been away and had a decent career, but affected by knee injuries, and had done a decent job as Sligo Rovers manager before he came to Cheltenham, including a little run into Europe. So he took over and he really got more out of the good players that were already there. The summer of 97, he brought in Book, Milton, Dale Watkins. I don't think anyone was expecting what was to unfold over the next 12 months. Cheltenham had never finished above 11th before in the conference, and they finished second and won the FA Trophy at Wembley. That trophy final showed the potential fan base that Cheltenham have got. 18,000 at Wembley, obviously financial boost. They'd also reached the third round of the FA Cup that year. Going into 98-99, suddenly there was a bit of belief that Cheltenham could actually do it. Paul Baker was the ambitious chairman. Steve Cottrell was the very, very ambitious manager. Didn't have a great start. Lost the first game and drew a couple, but then went on a winning run of 7. And Rushden were the main title rivals, but Cheltenham always had the edge over them. And to do it in style with that Easter Saturday win over Rushden and then the 22nd of April win over Yeovil 3-2, which everyone who was there will never forget it. 97th minute winner from Michael Duff. Incredible way to win it with 3 games to spare in the end, which they'd done the job, and Cheltenham was transformed forever that day. Yeah,
well, on our chat, we're going to be talking to Dave Norton, Michael Duff, and Keith Knight, all individuals who had sort of a big role to play in the season, and in terms of the history books, played big parts in some of those big sort of stories that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, Dave Norton was a great story. He was only at the club for a year, but he made a huge impact. He'd been relegated from the Football League with Hereford, had a terrible amount of injuries. I think he thought he was going to have to retire, but he came in pre-season, impressed Steve Cottrell, and he was one of the Hereford 4, along with John Brough, Richard Walker, and Neil Grayson, who come in the previous season. Cheltenham really capitalised from Hereford's financial problems. signed really the core of their team, all sort of leadership characters, and Norton was definitely one of them. So Norton went into midfield and was absolutely outstanding throughout the 98-99 season. I'd probably say after Grayson, he was probably, in my opinion, the top performer after Neil Grayson. Funnily enough, in the John Murphy team, Cheltenham had signed quite a few ex-Swindon players. Abley, Hughes, Baverstock and Colley had all been on the books of Swindon. And then Cheltenham did it with Hereford. They picked off some of Hereford's best players. It was a bit different with Swindon because they hadn't been in financial trouble and those lads had been released, but they were hungry for it after being released by Swindon. So Cheltenham brought in Norton, one of the Hereford four, and he unfortunately, once Cheltenham won the league, he couldn't go up into the Football League because of an insurance payout that he'd taken due to his injuries. And I think there was talk about him becoming a coach, but he decided to go to Yeovil and carry on playing, and obviously then ended up at Forest Green. But great character in the dressing room, David Norton, really popular guy. Keith Knight was a great story because he was a Cheltenham lad. He'd been at the club as a youngster, gone and played for Reading, played in Holland for a while. He'd been at Trowbridge, Gloucester, came back to Cheltenham. Steve Cotterill brought him back on loan initially from Hales Owen. But he was a really exciting winger, and obviously he scored the winning goal against Rushden at home in the 1-0 win in front of over 4,000 in the autumn, and then he set up the winning goal for Duff against Yeovil. I think he'd gone on from the bench. Bob Bloomer told Michael Duff to go up for the free kick. I don't think he was going to go up for it because they had some other big lads. Mark Freeman would have been up there, John Brough, Jamie Victory, but Michael Duff got pushed forward. Keith Knight put the crossover, and I think everyone knows what happened next in the 97th minute. So Keith Knight definitely played a big part. And as for Michael Duff, Keith Knight and David Norton both had to miss out on the chance to go pro because Norton's injuries and the insurance payout, and Keith Knight had a job that he didn't want to give up at the age of 30. So he went back to semi-pro football with Worcester. But for Duff, it was the dream to get into full-time football. So he went up with Cheltenham from the Southern League to the Conference to what was then Division 3 and then Division 2 after that, now League 1. But I think that was a big moment for him. I think he would have been 21 when Cheltenham won the Conference. Cotterill recalled him from a loan spell at Sirens the 2 seasons before, put him into the team, and he quickly improved and made the step up. So he was the young lad of what was quite an experienced team, and everyone knew he'd play higher.
And John, the first of our Zoom chats is going to be with the most recent title-winning squad in 2016 that gained promotion to the Football League. Cheltenham had been in the Football League for so long and then dropped out. How important was it that this group of players, this newly put together group of players, got the club back into the Football League at the first time of asking?
Well, it might sound a bit dramatic, but there was talk about getting bouncing straight back up to save the club. And that might be a little bit over dramatic because I think the club would have carried on, but it would have been very different and changes would have had to be made if the club hadn't come straight back up. So when I say there was a bit of pressure in 98-99 because of the trophy win and finishing second, in 2015-16, Paul Baker told Gary Johnson they had to get promoted. That was his pure aim. That's why he didn't take the FA Trophy that seriously. It was all about winning the league and getting straight back into the Football League. So if that hadn't happened, I think staff would have lost their jobs. I think people would have had to go part-time. Players would have had to go part-time. And it would have probably, obviously, the longer you stay down, we've seen some big clubs struggle to get out of that league. Not many teams have done it first time. So to have that sort of pressure, put together a squad from completely scratch and have 11 people making their debuts on the first day of the season, what Johnson achieved and what Cheltenham achieved in 15-16 was truly remarkable. And,
how much was that National League title winning season a contrast to the season the club had spent in the Football League the year before that, in terms of the emotional journey of going from various different managers, dropping out the league for the first time in many, many years, to suddenly one consistent manager, one consistent squad and flying back into the Football League?
Yeah, 14-15 was a year to forget. Right from Asa Hall getting injured on the opening day of the season, although Cheltenham won that game at Bury with a Joe Hanks goal, it was Asa Hall had come in, did his Achilles on the opening day and missed pretty much the whole of the season. So it started badly. Mark Yates had done a brilliant job, but he started to struggle a bit, and they decided that it was time for him to go in November. Paul Buckle came in, didn't last long, didn't work out. He went in early in the new year, I think February he went. Russell Milton took over for a few games, got a bit of positivity going and got a couple of good results, but then had a few defeats against Plymouth and Exeter, and the board decided to give it one more go So suddenly Cheltenham found themselves with their fourth manager in the season. Gary Johnson came in, and it was a bit too late. Really, he couldn't really sign anyone. Had one win and one draw and lost the rest, but it wasn't obviously his team. But there was no real upturn, and I think it became pretty clear that Cheltenham were going down. It was actually confirmed on the penultimate game of the season. So Cheltenham went to Wimbledon on the last day and drew, knowing that they'd be going back to the National League, and they didn't know at that point whether Gary Johnson would be staying on or not. But he did. He signed a contract for the following year, and the rebuilding started. I think Aaron Downs was his first signing. Jack Munns was his second. Kyle Storer came in all the same week. He started his business early, and he got pretty much all of them spot on. And there were a couple of loan lads that season that didn't make a big impact, but all of the permanent signings seemed to just hit it off. And yeah, incredible season. Record-breaking points total of 101. And it was, to answer your question, it was absolute opposite of the previous season, where Cheltenham had been struggling, bad atmosphere, too many changes too quickly. 15-16, all the changes that did happen made a positive impact, and it was a joy to watch.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there Kyle Storer. He's going to be joining us as part of our Zoom chat, along with Danny Wright, Daniel Parzo, and also another Dan Holman, who, of course, came midway through the season. When I mentioned those names there, in National League terms, a massive amount of playing experience, even before the start of that Cheltenham season.
Yeah, Kyle Storer came in from Kidderminster, and he'd been at Wrexham as well. So he'd had a decent experience in the conference, but he'd never played in the Football League before. But he wanted it. He wanted that chance in the Football League. Dan Parslow wrote a letter asking for a trial, having been released by York City. I don't think Gary Johnson was particularly looking for another centre-back, but Parslow asked for a trial. And he was so good in pre-season that he got a deal and went straight into the team next to Downs. Although Rob Dickey was on his way. So they had three good centre-halves. Dickey played a little bit of right-back or on the right side of a three. That was Parslow was, just very... Stoz was a loud and influential character in the dressing room, life and soul of the party. Parslow was a bit quieter, but led by example and very popular with his teammates, and he won Players Player of the Year. And Stoz obviously ended up as captain after Aaron Downs did his ACL in January. And then as for Holman, Danny Wright was sort of the main man up front. We'll come to him in a minute, but he played a bit up front with Amari Morgan-Smith. He picked up an injury in the FA Cup replay against Havant and Waterlooville. Billy Waters was used wide a little bit, probably more than he was up front. And I think Johnson felt like in January they just needed one more goal scorer. And he'd been banging the goals in for Woking, Dan Holman. So to get him in, he came in and was full of confidence. A fully fit Dan Holman was one of the best finishers we've ever seen at Cheltenham. And he just scored consistently, joint top scorer in the league with Hammond that year. And him and Danny Wright hit it off. And he scored 4 goals in a game, incredible, against Woking. Scored goals in the game against Halifax to seal the title, and he was a great addition midway through the season. It was just a shame that injury probably hampered him after Cheltenham got back into the Football League. But Danny Wright, a bit like Kyle Storer, had never been in the Football League, had been a consistently good National League player with Forest Green, Wrexham, Kidderminster, Gateshead, Histon. He'd had a good non-league career, but he'd never had that chance in the league. And he came in having addressed his gluten intolerance, which I remember talking to him about in his first interview after he signed. He'd worked out what it was that was making him feel lethargic and really affecting his ability to train in the last 90 minutes. And he was fitter than ever. And I remember going to watch the pre-season tests, and he was actually one of the quickest in the squad with a very unusual running technique, but deceptively quick for somebody that's probably 6'2" and excellent in the air. So he was really good all season. He was supporters player of the year and scored consistently and was a really important sort of figurehead and focal point for the front of that team. And also great character off it. He forged great friendships off the pitch with Harry Pell, Aaron Downs. They're still very close to this day. But it was a team full of great characters and, crucially, good players.
Brilliant. Well, John, we're going to be broadcasting the Zoom chats on Saturday, Sunday and Monday evening. We've got the 2016 squad, like I said, on Saturday night. Then we've got the 1999 squad on Sunday evening. And then on Monday, we're going to be looking back at the 1985 squad on what will be, of course, the 35th anniversary celebration of their promotion to the Alliance League, or what became, of course, the conference. So, John, thank you very much for joining me. I'm very much looking forward to speaking to some of the heroes from those past Cheltenham Town promotions as part of our Champions Weekend.
Brilliant. Cheers, Joyce.